In 1982, Pablo Escobar was elected to the Colombian Congress. He sat in the national legislature. He voted on laws. He attended sessions. And under Colombian law, that seat gave him full parliamentary immunity from criminal prosecution. A man who, at that precise moment, was running the most profitable cocaine operation in human history, was untouchable because the Colombian people had voted him into office. Think about what that required. Not just money, not just violence. It required a system, a deliberate, structured, financially sophisticated system that had already purchased enough of the political apparatus to make that moment possible. The election was not the beginning, it was the graduation ceremony. In Colombia, there is a phrase, plata o plomo, silver or lead. You take the bribe or you take the bullet. In the late 1980s, an estimated one-third of Colombia's elected officials were receiving direct payments from the Medellín Cartel. This is not the Pablo Escobar story you have been told. This is the one that was buried. Welcome to Beyond the Forgotten. To understand how a drug lord purchased a government, you must first understand the government that was for sale. Colombia, in the 1970s, was a country held together with fraying rope. Decades of civil conflict. La violencia, the brutal partisan war between liberals and conservatives that killed somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people between 1948 and 1958, had left institutions hollowed out and a population deeply distrustful of state authority. What followed La Violencia was not stability. It was a negotiated power-sharing arrangement called the National Front, in which liberal and conservative parties simply agreed to alternate the presidency and split government positions between themselves regardless of election results. The cocaine trade arrived. And it did not arrive with Pablo Escobar. The early cocaine networks in Colombia were small, decentralized operations. Smugglers, middlemen, and opportunists working routes that had previously carried marijuana. Escobar began as one of many, a small-time criminal from Medellín who ran stolen cars and contraband cigarettes before discovering that the margins on cocaine made everything else look amateur. What made Escobar different was a single insight, one he arrived at early and never abandoned. In Colombia, money could buy the state itself. The documented early bribes are not sophisticated. They are almost mundane. Police officers in Antioquia department receiving monthly payments to ignore shipments. Local customs officials whose salaries were supplemented by cartel envelopes. Municipal judges whose caseloads mysteriously thinned when cartel-connected defendants appeared on dockets. What Escobar understood, what distinguished him from every other trafficker of his generation, was that this was not opportunistic corruption. It could be systematized. It could be structured like a business, with budgets, with hierarchies, with payment schedules and performance expectations and consequences for non-compliance. The Medellín Cartel did not bribe officials the way a criminal bribes a cop. It ran what was, in practical terms, a parallel payroll system for the Colombian state. Accountants tracked the payments. Intermediaries managed the relationships. There were different payment tiers for different levels of official. And there was an enforcement arm for anyone who decided the state's salary was sufficient after all. Plata o plomo, always. Escobar didn't corrupt Colombia. He simply found a system that was already for sale and bought all of it. Begin with the judges, because the judges tell you everything. Between 1979 and 1991, more than 1,000 Colombian judicial officials were murdered. Judges, magistrates, investigators, prosecutors. The Medellín Cartel operated what Colombian journalists later documented as a systematic campaign to eliminate any member of the judiciary willing to hear extradition cases or prosecute cartel leadership. In 1986 alone, over 50 judges were assassinated. The ones who survived almost universally resigned. This was not random violence. This was policy. The cartel maintained lists. Judges were assessed, their histories reviewed, their financial situations examined, their families identified. The offer came first, always the offer. A payment, often substantial, in exchange for a favorable ruling, a delayed proceeding, a lost file. By 1987, Colombia had effectively no functioning judiciary willing to prosecute the cartel at the federal level. Not because Escobar was legally uncatchable, because he had systematically eliminated or compromised everyone with the legal authority to catch him. November 6, 1985. 41 guerrillas from the M19 movement stormed Colombia's Palace of Justice, taking hundreds of hostages, including 24 Supreme Court magistrates. The Colombian military's response, storming the building with tanks, results in the deaths of over 100 people, including 11 of those Supreme Court magistrates. DEA internal reports from the late 1980s, portions of which were obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests by American journalists, described Colombia's government during this period in language that agency officials were careful to keep classified. The phrasing that appears across multiple documents, a government operating under conditions indistinguishable from narco-state capture. At its peak, Pablo Escobar was not hiding from the Colombian government. He was operating inside it. What is documented about American intelligence in Colombia during this period is uncomfortable precisely because it is documented. The CIA's operational presence in Colombia throughout the 1980s was substantial. This is not disputed. The agency worked with Colombian military and intelligence assets in counterinsurgency operations against leftist guerrilla movements, primarily the FARC and ELN. What those relationships meant in practical terms was partnership with Colombian security forces that were, as established above, significantly penetrated by cartel money. The Iran-Contra connection requires precision here, because this is a space where documented fact and conspiracy theory have been deliberately conflated, sometimes by people whose interest lay in muddying the water. What is documented? The Senate Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Operations, DEA agent Celerino Castillo III, documented, in his own records and in testimony, specific instances in which cocaine trafficking operations connected to Contra supply networks were operating from Ilopango Air Base in El Salvador with the knowledge of CIA personnel. His reports were filed. They were not acted upon. He eventually left the agency and went public. He is still alive and still talking. Many of the documents he referenced remain classified. Congressional hearings were opened. Congressional hearings were quietly shelved. Testimony was taken. Transcripts were sealed. The architecture of what happened is visible in the negative space, in what was investigated, what was found, and what was then made very difficult to see. The corruption didn't stop at Colombia's borders. It just changed its suit and tie. Pablo Escobar died on that rooftop on December 2, 1993. Shot once behind the ear. The Colombian National Police took credit. The search block, the special unit created to find him, confirmed the kill. The question of who fired that final shot has never been definitively resolved. A group called Los Pepes, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, had been conducting a parallel campaign against cartel personnel during the final months of the hunt. Los Pepes included former cartel members turned enemies, paramilitary figures, and, as documented in subsequent Colombian judicial proceedings, personnel with connections to the Cali cartel. The DEA and Colombian intelligence had operational contact with Los Pepes. What that contact authorized, what information was shared, remains in its operational specifics classified. What happened immediately after Escobar's death tells you more about his corruption than his death itself. Of the officials documented as having received cartel payments during the Escobar era, the hundreds of police officers, judges, military figures, politicians, and customs agents whose complicity was established in Colombian and international investigations. How many were prosecuted? A small fraction. A fraction so small that the answer functions less as a statistic and more as a verdict on the system itself. The majority quietly retired. Some were promoted. The institutional infrastructure of corruption, the payment networks, the relationships, the culture of plata o plomo, did not die with Escobar. It transferred. The Cali cartel's ascendancy after Escobar's death was not a disruption of the bribery apparatus. It was a seamless succession. The same officials in many cases. The same payment mechanisms, different management. The system Escobar had built, and that the Cali organization had built in parallel, was more durable than either of the men who built it, because it was never really about men. It was about institutional capture. And institutions outlast individuals. There is a version of the Escobar story that is comfortable. That is why it gets told. The drug lord, the monster, the man who died on a rooftop. It begins and ends with one person. The version that doesn't get told is the one that implicates systems, institutions. The comfortable arrangement between criminal money and political power that exists not just in Colombia, but wherever there is power to be purchased and someone with enough money to purchase it. Colombia was not exceptional. Colombia was visible. What does it mean that this happened? Was documented, was partially exposed, was confirmed in congressional hearings and judicial proceedings and declassified intelligence files, and changed almost nothing in the structural relationship between criminal capital and political institutions? Not just in Colombia, everywhere. If this is the version of history they buried, imagine what else is beneath the surface. Beyond the forgotten exists to find it. Don't let them bury it twice.